and now we are live on Facebook. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Carvan. I am Ishan Sharma, founder of Carvan, and today I have with me a very special guest, one of my inspirations in history writing, Professor Mridula Mukherjee. Professor Mridula Mukherjee has been a professor at Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, for over 4 decades. He was director at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library from 2006 to 2011 and Dean School of Social Sciences, JNU, from 2012 to 2014. He has been a visiting fellow and professor at La Sapienza University of Rome, Institutes of Advanced Study at Nantes, France, at University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Lancaster, UK, and other universities, including the University of Tokyo, Japan, and Duke University, USA. He was a member of the External Advisory Board, Long Room Hub, Research Institute for Arts and Humanities, Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. He co-authored two very famous books, India Struggle for Independence and India Since Independence, both bestsellers published by Penguin, with multiple reprints and translations. She has authored Peasants in India, Non-Violent Revolution, and Colonizing Agriculture, The Myth of Punjab Exceptionalism. Sage Publications and RSS, School Textbooks and the Murder of Mahatma Gandhi, the Hindu Communal Project, published by Sage, that she co-authored. She is also the co-editor of the Sage series in Modern Indian History, in which 18 manuscripts have already been published. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to host Professor Mukherjee to speak on a very pressing issue, something that should concern every Indian in today's time. Peasants in struggle, the pre-independence tradition. Without further ado, I would warmly welcome and formally invite Professor Mukherjee to deliver today's Sarwan special lecture. Over to you, ma'am, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Shan. I'm delighted to be here today. I've been following your activities. In fact, I met you last year just before the COVID lockdown started. That was probably the last public function that I attended and talked at in your college. And since then, I have seen how you have set up with your uh, colleagues and friends this very good initiative, the Karma Initiative, and how you have made it a very vibrant forum and succeeded in getting very good scholars, eminent scholars included, uh, to come and give talks at this. I'm sorry it's taken me this long to come and speak in your forum. Always the date somehow clashed with something else, but it was not for lack of wanting to be on your very good forum. So thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with young people. All my life, what I have enjoyed most in my work and in my life is my interaction with my students. And therefore, I'm always happy to be around young people, especially students, and especially students of history with whom one has a special bond. So, thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to the interaction with the people who have been kind enough to come and listen to this lecture. Now, the topic of today's lecture is something that I would like to just spend a minute or two on. It's very obvious that your interest in this theme is because of what's happening around us today. And here I would like to just raise a few issues pertaining to the ongoing peasant protests, which we are seeing. Number one, it's a pretty long present protest that we have witnessed. They started at the end of November, and now it's been going on now for 2, 3, 4, over 4 months, and I think it's quite remarkable. the kind of solidarity and the kind of perseverance and the kind of discipline which the peasants have shown. People have been very surprised. They have expected the thing to fizzle out, the government not paying much heed to them after the initial round of talks. People generally felt that it will just die out and people will go back home. I think one reason for that skepticism was because of a general lack of knowledge and understanding about the rural life, about village life, about the culture and traditions and politics of our peasantry. I think, especially in the last, I would say, 2 or 3 decades, at the popular level, for example, in cinema, the focus has shifted completely to issues that concern urban audiences, and very often issues that only concern NRI audiences, because sometimes the whole movies, even it seems, are directed towards those who are living abroad or who are hoping to live abroad and have those aspirations. And unlike in the 50s and the 60s and even 70s, in fact, 70s was a very vibrant period when new cinema came and lasted into the 80s, there was still a focus on the life of rural India, on the life of our peasants, on the struggles of our agricultural laborers. Movies like Dobi Ka Zameen, for example, movies like Mother India, all, even movies which were not necessarily talking about economic issues or, were still based, the locale was in rural India. It was a very much a part of our lives. Now that alienation, you know I often used to ask my students in the class, when before I used to like start my course, because one would have to be talking about uh, what was happening in the villages, what is happening, and I would ask them, how many of you have visited a village? And apart from those who hailed from a village, who had grandparents in the village, or even their families came from villages, which would tend to be a small number in the class, the others who were urban dwellers had absolutely no familiarity with the village. They had never been there. They didn't know what a village settlement was like. They didn't know, for example, that in the villages, the so called untouchables, the scheduled caste, lived in separate areas. They didn't know what caste relationships were in a village, for example. So I used to find that first, before I could start to make sense of, for example, the history of the national movement, where the national movement was based largely on the strength of India's peasants, I would have to first explain to them what an Indian village was about, what was its character. So it's like a sociology class in on rural India before I could get to the history. And I think this is one reason why there is lack of understanding of their strength, the ability to persist with the protest, you know, and also in some ways, I would say it also explains the lack of empathy, because when you don't know people, it's very difficult to empathize with them, you know. So somewhere to explain also a kind of what we would call in Hindi udasinta, a kind of alienation, or not reacting to the sacrifices and what's going on right on our borders, the misery which people are facing. It's also because of our lack of familiarity with our kisans. We may idealize them as annadatas and all that, but we don't know them. you know we don't know. We imagine them to be some different species. No, they are not. They're human beings like you and me. But of course, rural culture has its specificities, it has its differences, and it has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. So anyway, I'm very glad, therefore, for this opportunity to be able to bring to you some of the history of these brave people who have been, I think, at the heart of the Indian nation building process. We would not be where we are today if it was not for the Green Revolution, for those who invested in the Green Revolution, their labor, their energies, their money, their families. We would not be able to hold our head high among the Committee of Nations if we were still begging for food as we were in the 1950s and 60s. So, for many reasons, apart from the fact that I think that peasant life and peasant mode of production, peasant mode of agriculture based on the family farm, I think is a tremendous inheritance of the world. It's like a what they call an intangible cultural, treasure, because it is a way of life which is an achievement of human society all over the world. And I think one of the tragedies has been in the late 20th and uh, 21st centuries is that in a large part of the world we are losing this. We are going on to an industrial mode of production for agriculture also, where you have huge companies, farms, land which is under the control of huge companies, etc., etc., etc. Not only for the economic reason, but also for social and cultural reasons. It means a whole loss of a way of life, a loss of a whole culture, which has many, many positive things in it, including, of course, the notion of community, the notion of bhaichara, the notion of solidarity. This is very much a contribution of our village life to our culture. You know, so we have to think about many things when we think about what's going on around us and why it is necessary to stand in solidarity with our peasants, because it, on the one hand, it is very much a struggle for their existence as an economic being, but it is also very much, they know that they are fighting for their identity, they are fighting for their very existence as not just as an economic being, but as a social and cultural being. If things go the way they are going, it will be a loss of a whole way of life. So I think it's very important, especially for young people in India today, to understand this. I would, of course, encourage all young people to make the effort and actually go to rural areas, go to a village, maybe of some relative, maybe of some friend. Go and spend some time there. Go and interact with the people. Go and find out what makes them tick. Go and talk to the children. Go and talk to the rural youth. I think it's very important. How can we call ourselves an Indian people unless we actually are able to understand and identify with those who are not necessarily living in urban India? The vast majority still lives in rural India, you know. So I'm very happy that I'm be able to contribute a little bit to this opening up of your minds to the majority of India. I think that's a very important task for a scholar. So let me begin by saying that, I gave the title as the pre-independence tradition, but as you can well imagine, pre-independence can mean going back into ancient history, and I think it's better we leave that to Professor Thapar, who knows much more about it than I do. But what I am going to concentrate on the period of the 20th century, and that is the period pre-independence. I'm going to concentrate actually on the 1920s and the 30s. Even if I go back into the 19th century, it will become much too long. Even this is too much. People know so little, they imagine what will there be. But when I tell you even a brief summary of it, you know it will be, even today, what I will be able to do for you is just a survey of what was going on in this period among the peasants in terms of their protest, their resistance, their movements. There was so much. It is such a rich history that I was actually thinking to confine myself to one decade to give you an idea of how much there was. So I will talk a bit about the 40s also, just 45 to 47, but essentially I'm going to talk about the period after, from non-cooperation movement onwards, because that is the period where the Indian, the mass phase of Indian national movement, Indian freedom struggle, and Indian this thing really begins. And that is when the peasant involvement also in the freedom struggle, as well as Kisan Sabha movements, peasant organizations emerge in a big way in India, which doesn't mean that there was nothing happening in the 19th century. There was, but I don't have the time to go into that today, except maybe just a couple of lines to give you a little background. So this is going to be the period on which I'm going to focus. Okay. So now, just as I said, a couple of things about the 19th century. Of course, the greatest movement which involved the peasants in the 19th century was the First Indian War of Independence, or the Great Revolt of 1857. That was essentially a revolt based on peasants. Even the sepoys who were part of it, the soldiers who were part of it, are peasants in uniform. And that's why there was such an intimate link between the soldiers and the peasants. So this was the main character of this revolt. Its main strength was based again on the peasants. I won't say more about it, but just to emphasize that, we cannot understand the revolt of 1857 without again looking at the history of the peasants and their struggles and their sacrifices. In the immediately after that, there was a powerful movement in Bengal, for example, which was called the Indigo Revolt. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but just to say that, a new kind of politics was emerging. This was different from 1857. It was largely based on taking recourse to legal means and protests, and there was a bit of violence. But essentially, we find a new trend emerging from the 1860s, 70s, and 1880s, especially in Bengal, where new kinds of associations, modern associations, something like unions, or what we later called the Kisan Sabhas, began to emerge, and especially among the tenants. And this then culminated in the government also responding with the Bengal Tenancy Act, etc. So we also find that the Indian middle class, especially the nationalist intelligentsia, are beginning to identify with the peasants in this period. The Indigo Revolt had support from this section. In the 1870s and 1880s, people like Surendranath Banerjee were very active on the whole tenant versus zamindar issue, mobilizing. And then we also find with Bal Gangadhar Tilak a great interest in peasant issues. Towards the end of the century, around 1897, there was a kind of movement in Maharashtra where he and his group, the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, were very active in mobilizing the peasants, teaching them about their rights, distributing pamphlets telling them that, when could they refuse to pay revenue, etc. In 1879, there was the revolt in Maharashtra, the uh, revolt of the peasants against moneylenders. That was a very important revolt, and there again, Rana Day was very involved in the legislation that came out, a protective debt legislation that came out after that. Generally, we find the Indian intelligentsia of the late 19th century, the nationalist intelligentsia, the whom we call the moderates or the early nationalists, are very concerned with peasant issues. Dadabhai Naoroji's whole work is to show how the poverty of the Indian peasant is linked to the drain of wealth. So he links colonialism directly, colonial exploitation, with the peasant and the poverty of the peasant. So the peasant is at the heart of the concerns of the national movement, also, right from the very beginning. It's not something that happens later. You know, that's very important. And all this background goes into building up to the period that I'm going to be talking about at length. All that background is very much there. Then, of course, we come to the Swadeshi movement, period 1905 to 1907, which started in Bengal, but then spread at a mass level to Punjab and to Maharashtra. And particularly in Punjab, it took on a peasant character, a rural character. There was a powerful movement called the Pagdi Sambhalo Jatta movement, in which one of the main leaders was Sardar Ajit Singh, who was the uncle of Bhagat Singh, Lala Lajpat Rai, and the two of them were actually sent into exile by the government for their role in this movement. It was a powerful elemental protest movement which emerged against government policies. And in fact, the government was forced to take back those three bills. It's very interesting. Three bills now, three bills then. The government then, right at the level of the viceroy, refused assent to those bills. So looks like peasants had an easier job persuading the British government than they have persuading our government now. And in fact, Lala Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh, who had been sent on exile, I mean, Lala Lajpat Rai was actually, his exile was reversed after 6 months. He was allowed to come back to India. So it's very interesting developments that took place right in the beginning of the century. And then I come to the period which I said I'll be talking about at length, which is the period from 1918-19 onwards, after the First World War. Now, very interesting development takes place in this period. As you know, there was the Home Rule League, which had been set up by Annie Besant and by Lokmanya Tilak. These were set up during the First World War. And they were not alternatives to the Congress. They were just organizations within in order to take on the work during the period of the First World War, when political activity was very difficult to carry on. And Tilak concentrated on the Bombay region, and Annie Besant and her Home Rule League were working in the rest of India. Now, in UP, Annie Besant's league was very popular. In fact, Jawaharlal Nehru also started his political career first joining the Home Rule League during the period of the war. And it was this Home Rule League that started to establish links with the Kisans in UP in 1918-99, particularly, and right from the very early period of 1919-20, Jawaharlal Nehru also gets involved with it. Interestingly, Madan Mohan Malviya was very much backing this in the early years before the organization started to become more militant. But in the early years, it was very much backed by him. So this was why I'm telling you this in some detail, because this was one of the first times that in an organized way, an effort was made to set up a Kisan Sabha. It was called the UP Kisan Sabha from 1918 onwards, and it had remarkable success. They set up something like 300 or so branches in the districts, mostly of central and eastern UP. And then soon after, when the non-cooperation movement began in August 1920, that added a new energy to the movement, because, as you know, Gandhiji gave the call for the non-cooperation, and there was a move very much to go to the rural areas. He asked students to give up their colleges and schools and go to the rural areas. You know, and as part of that process, also middle class leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and a band of them from that region, they started to move around in the rural areas and organize the peasants. This then led to widespread peasant mobilization, to the extent that peasants started coming to these meetings, which would be held in huge numbers. 10,000, 20,000 became quite common. In villages, meetings would be held. But, you know, I want to share with you Ayodhya then and Ayodhya now, what Ayodhya was a symbol of. In December 1920, a huge UP Kisan Sabha meeting was held in the town of Ayodhya, where more than 1 lakh Kisans came on the issue of feudal oppression, you know, Bedakhli, high rents, illegal levies, Begar, all the issues which were agitating the peasants at that time. I was myself fascinated by this, that how history, you know, changes. A city which in 1920, 100 years ago, 1920 December, 100 years ago was a symbol of peasant protest, has now become a symbol of something completely different. Then it was a symbol of unity, because in these meetings, what is particularly remarkable is that peasants of all religions were together. There was no distinction. There were also peasants of all classes were together. High caste, low caste, bigger ones, smaller ones, they were all coming together in this very interesting movement in UP. In January, in fact, then a number of violent incidents took place because the talukdars and the zamindars, they became very aggressive and started attacking the peasants, getting them arrested on false charges. So people got very angry, and there were a few incidents of looting and violence and attacks on property, as a result of which the government got a chance and they clamped down heavily on this movement. But before that, this movement had become very popular. One of the charismatic leaders of the peasants was a man called Baba Ramchandra, whom you might have heard about. He was a very interesting character. Again, outsider, insider, we are now so concerned. Can somebody from outside become, active in one region? Are you an outsider, insider? Baba Ramchandra, one of the most popular leaders of the UP Kisans, was a Maharashtrian, a Brahmin. He was a wanderer. He landed up in Fiji as an indentured laborer, came back from there and started wandering as a sadhu in the villages of UP with a Ramayana on his back, and used to recite the Ramayana beautifully, and thereby rural audiences started coming to him. And then out of that emerged this very charismatic and very interesting peasant leader. No, and nobody in UP asked him, "आप कौन हो, जात क्या है, कहाँ से आए हो?" जात ना पूछो, leader की. Hmm? Nobody asked him. They were quite happy to accept him as their leader 100 years ago. Our people were so broad-minded. As long as you were giving them what they needed, which was leadership, you know. And he was a fantastic character. In this meeting in Ayodhya, he came all tied up in ropes to symbolize the oppression of the Kisan. That this is what the Kisan's life is like. He's tied up in ropes. In another case, you would find him where there was a meeting, you would find him in a tree. He would be talking to the people from standing, sitting in the top of a tree. So he was a very interesting character, maverick character. But Jawaharlal Nehru has also written about him in his autobiography. Very interesting account. And then this part of the movement, it kind of merged with the non-cooperation movement, because non-cooperation movement was also at its height. Also, what was very interesting was that peasants started attending the annual sessions of the Indian National Congress in large numbers. At the 1919 session in Amritsar, after Jallianwala Bagh, large number of peasants attended. Even earlier in 1918, at the Delhi session, large numbers of peasants attended. In fact, the descriptions are of how the pandal was flooded for the first time in the history of the Congress with these people who were so obviously from a rural background. That's what changed the character of the Congress. It's when peasants started coming in with their numbers into the Congress, And of course, under Gandhi, I'm saying even before non-cooperation, this was happening. Of course, after 1920, Congress becomes very much a present organization. So what we are seeing in this period of the non-cooperation movement is a kind of fusing of the two movements, of the Kisan Sabha movement, which had started, the non-cooperation movement, which was a more political movement, and a kind of healthy fusion, one helping the other. I'm also raising this point because I find that in the political discourse today, when we read about it in the newspapers and all that, big issue is being made about how political parties should not be allowed in peasant meetings, how this whole peasant protest must be kept non-political, or at least political parties should not be allowed to come on the stage. They should, because today the word political has been given a meaning which is a negative meaning. But actually speaking, you see, even if you call it non-political, the peasant protest that's happening around us is deeply political. Political doesn't mean political parties only and electoral process. Politics is people getting involved in their own affairs, in public life, in the life of the community, in the life of the country. Electoral part is just one part of it. political parties are also involved in protest, rebellion, resistance. They have a role over there, you know. Can we imagine that the peasant protest that happened as part of the Naxal movement, for example, would happen without the role of the political party? These are false kind of binaries which are introduced into our discourse. And my own understanding here is that these are meant to weaken the peasant protest. Because the moment they get support from political party, you jump up and say, you are taking political or you are becoming political. It is not purely a peasant issue. Is the government not political? When I'm fighting something that's political, can I fight it with weapons which are non-political? Then I'm obviously weak from start. No? See, the government sends out BJP members and, politicians to the rural areas to go and spread their message that how the legislation that they have brought about is very good. That is a political act. They are not sending the bureaucrat. They are not saying the district magistrate will go and explain. They are asking their MLAs to go and explain, their leaders to go and explain. That is politics, no? That is using the political party. But peasants are not supposed to have anything to do with the political party. If they do, they become political and bad. I think it's very necessary to understand this and not fall for this trap and see it as a trap, which is meant to weaken the movement. In 1907, when the agitation took place in Punjab, which I talked to you about, was the Swadeshi movement, Lala Lajpat Rai was a major Congress leader. Ajit Singh was very much in the Congress. Bhagat Singh's father, Kishan Singh, was a Congress member. Nobody told, even the British government did not say that, we will not deal with you because it is the Congress is involved. They tried to. They used to try to also do this outsider-insider business. But nobody fell for it then. In fact, a movement to which I'll come later, the movement was pushed on this basis in Punjab because government refused to talk to a leader who they said is not from this district where the problem is, and he is not a peasant himself, but he's a leader of the peasants. So the movement said, sorry, we decide who is our leader. You will have to talk to our leaders whom we choose. You cannot tell us who your leader is, whether he's outsider, insider, this or that. So this is very interesting, and it's very important that these relationships and these things are also discussed and kept in mind. And the history of our peasant movement is very much a history where there was no such Chinese wall existing between politics or the national movement and the movement of the peasants. In fact, I will show you the periods of strength of the peasant movement are when it merges, gains from and takes strength from the freedom struggle, and vice versa. When the two are in fusion, when the two move together, both get stronger. And that is why always the government would want to separate them. So going back to 1921, then what we find is the government comes down very heavily, and the repression then naturally means that the movement can't go on for very long. But very soon, a different movement called the Eka Movement, which is a movement based on, very interestingly, a lot of more of the lower caste peasants, including a lower caste leader called Madari Pasi, emerges in the course of this movement. And this movement, in fact, goes on even beyond the non-cooperation movement. So, and it was very interesting movement where peasants, how they evolved their own methods. They would get together and they would dig a hole in the ground and pour water into it, and that was symbolic of the Ganga. And then they would take a pledge on the Ganga over that hole, saying that we will not betray the movement, we will not pay this extra rent, we will not pay illegal rent, we will stand firm, etc., etc. So, these rural idioms are also very important for us to try and understand how the peasant mind works. Nobody was telling them that they had to take those pledges, but this is the way in which they built their own solidarity. If we understand this, we can also understand why in the Gandhian idiom also, in his method also, there is a very important role of pledges, promises, where in a mass meeting he would ask people to pledge because he understood Indian culture. When people pledge to something, they do it with meaning. They are not doing it just like that, and they will try to stick to it. It has a moral weight on the person who's taking the pledge. And therefore, I found this very interesting parallel in the Kisan movement itself. Now, in the 1920s, I will not spend too much more time, but I will just mention the important ones. In the same year that I was talking about, 1921, you had the very powerful Mappila Peasants Revolt in Malabar. Now, this was again very interesting. It was essentially also a movement that emerged out of the broader freedom struggle, where the leaders of the Congress had been talking about tenancy reform. They had been talking about the difficulties which the tenants were facing at the hands of the big landlords who were called janmis. Now, in this particular region that I'm talking about, the tenants were mostly Mappilas. These were Muslim peasants called Mappilas. And they rose against the landlords. And in the initial stage of the movement, there was no communal element in this movement at all. In fact, the peasants would go through long stretches of territory where would be Hindu population and never touch anybody, and only go and attack the houses of the landlords, who mostly happen to be Hindu. But after some time, the government and the landlords and all succeeded in creating a divide within the movement. And since the movement did have a religious inspiration, it did have a religious, as I said, character, not in the sense of communal character, but religious for inspiration purposes, it became a little easy to try and introduce a communal element also. And also, the government was able to use some elements as spies and as people who would attack this movement. So, towards the latter part of this movement, unfortunately, it also got somewhat of a communal character where there were attacks on Hindus by the Muslim peasantry, which were not, connected to their being landlords, etc. So then, of course, what the government did, what they always do, once they were able to create this divide, then they were able to come down with a very heavy hand. And in fact, the sacrifices of the Mappila peasants, there were some 2,500 peasants lost their lives. There was a very nasty incident in which many of them were arrested and were being sent to the jail in a bogie of the train, and that they essentially died in that bogie. It was something like Nazi methods which were employed. And the tragedy was that because of this extremely severe repression, the Mappila peasantry remained non-political or apolitical right till the time of independence, because such a terrible terror was struck in that whole area that even 10 years later, 20 years later, when in the surrounding areas there was a very powerful peasant movement which emerged, especially under the aegis of the Congress Socialist Party and the communists and the Kisan Sabha. They could not make any headway in the Mappila area because of that memory of terror which was there. So that is also something we have to remember, that, we, excuse me, while it is very important that we talk about peasant heroism, their capacity to resist, their capacity to withstand repression, we must also not forget that severe repression sometimes, you know, does not lead to more resistance. It can also lead to a snuffing out of resistance. It all depends. So this is a history also that we have to remember with sorrow. You know. I'll take you forward now to the latter part of this decade and come to 1928, where the famous Bardoli Kisan struggle emerged. And this was a movement which emerged in a taluka of Surat district in Gujarat. It was just one taluka. It was not even a whole district, not even a whole state. And yet this movement shook the foundations of the British Empire, as the Viceroy and Secretary of State themselves recognized. It was very interesting, as with now, it was on an issue of the economic interests of the peasants. The government was trying to impose a resettlement of the land revenue, where they suggested a 30% enhancement in the land revenue, which was a big jump. So mobilization started against that, and the local Congress leaders, they came into the picture, and they started to discuss with the peasants on this issue. And it took a year or so for the consciousness to build up. They resisted, but the government continued. Government reduced a bit, but not enough. So finally, this movement emerged under the leadership of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and he organized the peasantry of Bardoli in a uh, one of the most intensive mass non-violent movements that India has ever seen. It was like a laboratory experiment. The taluka became like a closed area, as if there was a complete shutdown over there, like a lockdown, which we now understand. Nobody could be seen on the streets. The officials, the government officials, could not even get transport. They would not get the services of a barber. They would not get the services of a washerman. It became impossible to even move from the district headquarters or the town or the railway station into the interior areas, because nobody would take you there. No, a complete boycott, non-payment of land revenue. When they would go to realize the land revenue, the movement had organized it in such a way, the volunteers were there. They would tell the peasants in advance, this party is coming to take your land revenue, run away. So people would run away. There used to be children who used to be stationed in trees, who would shout and beat things so that the message went. And before the tax collectors could emerge, the peasants had locked their houses and gone away and hid in the fields. Many of them would go and hide in neighboring fields and neighboring Baroda state also. So, like this movement was a very powerful movement, and ultimately, the government had to bend down, found some face saving formula, and appointed an inquiry committee, which ultimately said the increase should only be 6% instead of the original 30%. But what was important about this movement was it galvanized the whole of India. You know, Bardoli days were celebrated all over the country. Bardoli became a symbol of the Indian peasant protest. You know? So, such was the power of this movement, which carried on for many months. And they faced severe repression. Lands were confiscated, property was confiscated, the household goods would be taken away to pay for the land revenue. But this was a very powerful and a very important movement. And what was very interesting about it was that it it became a kind of model for mass non-violent protest. I said, kind of laboratory experiment. And it had a very powerful impact on the freedom struggle in the subsequent days as well. I will now come to the 1930s. Uh, okay, just one minute. I just wanted to read out to you one quotation from uh, Mahatma Gandhi about the impact of the Bardoli movement. The relationship of Bardoli and other peasant struggles with the struggle for freedom can best be described in Gandhiji's pithy words, and I quote, "Whatever the Bardoli struggle may be, it is clearly not a struggle for the direct attainment of Swaraj. that every such awakening, every such effort as that of Bardoli will bring Swaraj nearer, and may bring it nearer even than any direct effort, is undoubtedly true. Just to emphasize what that quotation is. See, he understood it's a dialectical relationship which he is pointing out. It's not a direct struggle for freedom, and yet it may bring freedom closer than any direct struggle. That's how you have to understand the impact of resistance and struggle. The struggle which we see around us is not for what is going to happen to India in the next elections. And yet, these protests that we are seeing may have a more powerful impact on our future than any direct mobilization for the next elections or for elections that are going on now. You don't have to direct politics, or whatever. I mean, in history, what we understand, cause and effect is not something direct. That's why history is so complex. We are always trying to find the interlinkages between different aspects of life. An event here may have an impact somewhere else, completely unrelated. And this is what Gandhiji is trying to tell us about the impact of the Bardoli struggle and other such struggles. Of course, I think what is very important is how any struggle, even if it is a lost struggle, gives strength and training to those who have been part of it. It also trains the rest of society. To see other people struggling, to see people resisting is also uplifting for you. Somewhere it takes you out of your narrow concerns with yourself. When you see how people are sitting at the Singhu border or at the Tikri border or the Ghazipur border or in villages in Western UP, in Punjab, in Haryana, in Rajasthan, where all the, and so many other places where you see how people are coming out in their thousands and hundreds of thousands and braving heat and cold and oppression, it does something to you. It takes you away from your narrow concerns with what is going to be the next order that you can place from Zomato, there are people who are living without these concerns and probably living better lives and more meaningful lives. It helps us. It helps all of us towards something that has a higher purpose, that has a wider social purpose, that gives a different meaning to life, including to our lives. So I will now take you to the 1930s. And here, I think, just as I began with non-cooperation movement, I'll begin with the civil disobedience movement. It started with the Dandi March, 1930. March 12th. You just had a reenactment of that, which doesn't seem to have inspired anybody. But anyway, so the civil disobedience movement, again, it is not a peasant movement directly, but it was a movement based very much on the Indian peasants. The movement had, in different parts of the country, if we were to do a survey, the movement was actually sustained by what was happening in the rural areas. In UP, for example, a very powerful Hisan movement was there. No rent, no tax. In Kheda district in Gujarat, there was a very powerful no tax movement, where thousands of peasants left their homes and went and stayed for months on end in the neighboring state of Baroda to escape the repression of the British. Anti-Chaukidari tax movement, which again was based on the peasants in Bengal and Bihar. Very powerful movements over there. One by one, if I was to take you around the country, even when they were not in Punjab, there was a no tax movement. Yeah, so in fact, even more than the non-cooperation movement, the civil disobedience movement was very much based on the rural areas. This doesn't mean that it was not powerful in the towns, but it had a very strong base among the rural areas. So now the result of this was two very important things for the future of the Kisan Sabha, for the Kisan movement in India. One, the the civil disobedience movement energized, it galvanized, it mobilized a new generation of youth. It radicalized a new generation of youth, just as non-cooperation movement had taken young people out of their colleges and schools and sent them into villages. Now those people were now, by now they were leaders. They had become the next generation. They were now in their 30s. When at that time they were 18, 19, 20, 22. It's 10 years later. So now a new generation comes into the movement. And this new generation brings new blood, new ideas, new forms of radicalization. Secondly, what happens in this period is immediately after of course, it mobilizes the peasantry in a very big way, gives them a sense of their own strength. So you have two things that you need for protest: politically awakened peasantry and a cadre of workers and leaders. These are essential ingredients of any protest. So, what do we find? That after the civil disobedience movement ends in 1932, 1933, a new political phase begins in India, which is a new kind of radicalization of under left ideas takes place. And the first instance we have of that is in 1934, the formation of the Congress Socialist Party. Communist Party is already there, but during the period of civil disobedience movement, it could not play much of a role because it was following a policy which was different, which was not that of aligning with the National Congress. I don't have time to go into those details. But 1934, Communist Party also changes its line to one of united front. Congress Socialist Party is formed. Communists also become members of Congress Socialist Party, and Congress Socialist Party is a party within the Congress, which is consolidating left forces within the Congress. It's not a party outside. That's why the name Congress Socialist Party. Now, this group of leaders are very active, and they now give an impetus to the formation of an all India Kisan organization. This is a very important development because till now, the movements that had been there of Kisans, of peasants, were all at a regional level. They were not consolidated at a national level. So this process leads to the formation in 1936 of what is called the All India Kisan Congress. And the title very soon changes to All India Kisan Sabha. So this is a very, very important development because now you have a national level peasant organization. Swami Sejanand was the first president, and N.G. Ranga was the general secretary, a very important peasant leader from Andhra. Swami Sejanand, the very important peasant leader from Bihar. And there were many others many communists who were in it. It had the patronage of Jawaharlal Nehru. It had the support of the Congress. And this was in fact at the Lucknow Congress that this took place. And next year at the Faizpur Congress, also it was very important, a jatha of peasants marched 200 miles, some 500 peasants marched 200 miles to reach Faizpur, and there they were welcomed by Jawaharlal Nehru and a host of other leaders to the Congress, and a agrarian program of the Congress was adopted, which became part of its manifesto for the 37 elections. So as you can see, this linkage is constantly between the Kisan movement and the freedom struggle, and both enriching the other. In fact, the All India Kisan Sabha said that its main purpose was to strengthen the role of Indian peasants in the freedom struggle in India. They did not see them as something separated from the freedom struggle. So we have to understand them as both going together. Now, again, very briefly, after that, what we had, the most important next development was the formation the provincial elections, which took place in 1936-37, after which in 9 provinces, Congress ministries or Congress coalition ministries were formed. And this was very important because it provided a freer political atmosphere, more civil liberties, more capacity to mobilize for the Kisan organizations. So, on the one hand, you have a powerful peasant organization, all India level, which has emerged, which is guiding the movement at the local levels in each provincial levels. There are provincial level Kisan congresses or Kisan committees or Kisan Sabhas, all linked to this nationwide thing. And then you have new provincial governments which come, which are committed to greater freedom, which are committed to the Kisan's cause. So a kind of period of flowering of the peasant movement in India takes place. One could say that in the period 1937, 38, 39, the peasant movement in India reached its high water mark or its peak in the pre-independence period. So this is very interesting also because at the level of policy and at the level of legislation also, the Congress governments in various provinces took initiatives which were pro-peasant. Many of them passed legislation which reduced or cancelled the indebtedness of peasants. Many of them passed legislation which in some way decreased the exploitation of the tenants, So there were a number of, I don't have the time to go into details of each province. Then since there were powerful peasant mobilization which took place at this time in different parts of the country, various governments would appoint inquiry committees to go into the agrarian issue. For example, in Kerala, the Madras government appointed a Zamindari Inquiry Committee, which T. Prakasham, the Andhra leader, he then went around the whole of Kerala and held meetings. And this gave a chance to the Karshaka Sangams of Kerala to mobilize and to present themselves before this committee. And then it gave a very radical report which recommended the abolition of the Zamindari system. Unfortunately, by then, Congress ministries had resigned because of the war, so it could not be implemented. But all this after independence or just before independence became very useful because all this was already done. Similar kind of thing was happening in Bihar. So just to give you a very brief idea of the kind of movements that were happening in this period, 37 to 39, I'll just mention very, very briefly. One sec, I just... Yeah, I already mentioned Kerala. And here I would like to just mention that the name for the organization, I think I already mentioned it, was Karshaka Sangams. Karshaka means Kisan, and Sangam means Sabha or organization. And here it was largely the result of the CSP activists, among whom were many communists also, who had been working among the peasants since 1935, that a very powerful movement emerged. And the demands were for abolition of the feudal levies, against the practice of advance rent, stopping of eviction of tenants by landlords. But also demanded reduction in tax, rent, and the debt burden, and the use of proper measures by the landlords when measuring the grain rent. And the main forms of mobilization and agitation were the formation and meetings of village units of the Karshaka Sangams, conferences, and big meetings or big conferences. What was very popular was, and very effective, was the marching of a jatha or large groups of peasants to the houses of big landlords or janmis, placing the demands before them and securing immediate redressal. This became a very, very popular form of mobilization. I have already mentioned the tour of the Zamindari inquiry committee. And also one thing very interesting was in many of these places, marches would be taken out. Kisan marches would be taken out. They would start from one point, go around the countryside, and then meet at a particular point. In Kerala, for example, two marches started. Jathas of 500 each started from one in Karivallur in North Malabar and from Kanjikode in the south. And after moving through the whole stretch, uh, being received and hosted by the local units, they converged near Calicut, where then an all Malabar Karshaka Sangam conference was held. Just to give you this little detail, to give you a feel of what kind of movements were going on. Similarly, in coastal Andhra Pradesh, also, a very powerful movement emerged in this period under the Andhra Provincial Riots Association and the Andhra Zamin Riots Association, uh, where movement against the enhancement in land revenue was one of the issues which had been at the forefront. And again, here, this weapon of the peasant marches was employed very effectively. In fact, peasant marches had been going on since 1933 in coastal Andhra. They would converge on the district or taluka headquarters and present a list of demands to the authorities. But in 1938, the Provincial Kisan Conference organized for the first time a march on a massive scale, a true long march in which over 2,000 Kisans marched a distance of over 1,500 miles, starting from Ichhapur in the north, covering 9 districts, walking for a total of 130 days, en route holding hundreds of meetings attended by lakhs of peasants, collected over 1,100 petitions, and then presented all these to the provincial legislature in Madras city on 27th of March 1938. And one of their main demands was for debt relief. And this was then incorporated into the legislation passed by the Congress ministry and was widely appreciated in Andhra. They also appointed a Zamindari inquiry committee, but the legislation based on it could not be passed before the ministries resigned. It was just to give you a little feel of the kind of mobilization that was taking place. Similarly, I don't have time to go into details. In Bihar, as you know, there was a very powerful movement here. One of the main issues was indebtedness and how the lands called Bakasht lands, uh, which were lands of occupancy tenants, which they had lost to the zamindars because of heavy indebtedness caused by the depression, economic depression of 1929-30 onwards, and how here the Congress ministry then initiated legislation for the reduction of rent and restoration of Bakash lands. However, in Bihar, there was also a lot of conflict between the Kisan Sabha movement and the ministry because they were not happy with the kind of relief measures that the ministry thought it was possible to give them. In Punjab, again, this was a period of very powerful mobilization. I don't have the time to go into it, but Amritsar and Lahore were two districts where very powerful movements emerged around the issue of resettlement of and enhancement of land revenue and increase in the canal tax. Jathas marched to district headquarters, huge demonstrations were held. Lahore Kisan Morcha went on for many months, and hundreds of and even thousands of people courted arrest. Another kind of struggle was there in the canal colony areas, Multan, Montgomery, where it was the tenants at will, or the muzaras as they were called, who were struggling against the private companies to whom the government had leased the land and who were treating the tenants as people who had no rights at all. And again, very interesting, the kind of fear which the peasants in Punjab and other places have now, that they will lose their land to private companies. This was very much a reality in Punjab in the pre-independence period. And there were powerful movements against it. So I'm very sure this is part of the consciousness and knowledge of those who are agitating in Punjab. They know what private company, being tenants of private companies actually means. It is not just a theoretical possibility, it was a historical fact, and there were big struggles against it. So, uh, and of course, Bengal was another area where there were very powerful movements, and so was Orissa. In Assam, also, we had a no revenue movement. I don't have the time to go into the details. So, as I had said before, this period represents a high watermark because of the, as I said, the more freedom they had, and the other historical forces which all came to a head: availability of a leadership, radicalization, people committed to mobilizing the peasants. So, a completely, you would say that the peasants had reached a completely new stage of preparedness, of political awareness, of knowledge of their rights, of their capacity to struggle by the end of 1939. Of course, the war came, Congress ministries resigned. During the period of the war, this kind of peasant movement obviously could not go on. That doesn't mean peasants were lying quiet. Peasants were very much part of the anti war protests in 1940. They were very much part of the individual civil disobedience movement, especially its mass version in 1941. And peasants were at the heart of the Quit India movement. You cannot imagine the Quit India movement without the participation of the peasants. The urban part of it died out in just a few days. And after that, it was only the in rural India that the big movement was there. Eastern UP and Bihar, parts of it had a parallel, had a sort of, almost ended British rule for 15, 20 days. Parallel governments were formed in Midnipur, in Bengal, in Satara, Pune, in Maharashtra, went on right until 1943 and 1944. There was the whole sabotage movement, which was again based on the sympathy of the rural masses. So it was a period where peasants were very active, but not in a Kisan Sabha type of movement. After the war was over and political activity picked up from 1945, especially 46 to 47, we have another phase. Now, this is very interesting because now it is very clear that independence is coming, and independence is coming very soon. So the character of the struggles that we have now, the peasant struggles that we have now, is very different in the sense, one, there is a vigor to them, there is an urgency to them, and there is a confidence in them. And here it is an assertion of their power and their position which they want in the new India. So they are basically sending a very strong message. We are not going to keeping lying down. We are expecting a change in our lives. In Bihar, it was very militant, the kind of movements that we had. In fact, a lot of violence also took place. But in fact, the Zamindari abolition thing even started before independence in Bihar. But there were powerful movements. In Punjab, there was the Harsha Chhina Moga Morcha, which was on an issue of irrigation outlets. In Bengal, there was the famous Tebhaga movement, which was about the share of the sharecropper in the produce. They said it used to be half, they wanted only one third, and a bill was in fact introduced in the Bengal Legislative Assembly in early 1947. It could not be passed. It by the Muslim League government didn't actually pass it. So in 1950, then in independent India, the Congress government passed the Bargadars Act. Similarly, in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, Hyderabad, coastal Andhra, support, we had the famous Telangana peasant struggle. So we had a lot of mobilized. In Punjab, for example, the Canal Colony Peasant Movement, also the Neely Bar Montgomery against the private companies, against the landlords, also started. In Patiala state, there was a very vigorous movement, which I didn't mention earlier, which had started as early as 1929-30, and it had gone on right through the 1930s, but interrupted by the war. That again picked up in 1945 and finally came to a fruition in 1953 when a legislation was passed giving the opportunity to the tenants to acquire the land which they felt was theirs at very low compensation. So, a spate of struggles, a wave of struggles we find in this period just before independence. And all this, I'm not going into the period after independence, but we cannot understand the agrarian legislation that comes in immediately after independence. The zamindari abolition type, somewhere it's jagirdari, somewhere it's zamindari. In Hyderabad, it's called jagirdari, somewhere it could be talukdari. But basically, abolition of rentier landlordism and handing over of land to substantial bodies of tenant cultivators, which happens from the late 40s, early 50s, right? Some of it carrying on till the mid late 50s. This is all because of this pressure which has built up. The very fact that land revenue no longer remains an issue is because even when not formally abolished, land revenue is never increased. So after some time through inflation and everything, it becomes a non-issue. No agricultural tax, no taxation of agriculture under income tax. All these are achievements of the peasant struggle and of the commitment of the freedom struggle to the amelioration of the economic and social conditions of the peasants. We cannot understand one without the other. So, this is the story that I wanted to tell you. It's, as I said, it is just a survey that I could give you. On each one of these, I could give you an hour-long lecture at least, talking about so many aspects. I've not even been able to talk about the generalizations, so many things. What I would like to emphasize is that though we have movements where the movements do use some amount of violence here and there, but I think what's very important is to recognize that this entire period that I've talked about, in fact, most of it, not just 20th century, but from 1860 onwards, the peasant struggles are essentially uh, struggles which are non-violent in character. The methods they follow are the same methods that are followed in the national movement. Mobilization through meetings, conferences, satyagraha, civil disobedience, non-payment of rent, non-payment of tax, putting pressure, jathas, you know, all the forms, all the weapons which we are familiar with in the freedom struggle, is the same weapons which are employed by the peasants. So again, when we are looking around us today and when we see they are constantly emphasizing, the peasants are emphasizing that theirs is a non-violent protest. This is also very much the tradition of Indian Kisan protest for the previous 100 years or more. It is not something different. There are, I said, there are variations. I'm not saying each and every movement was like that. But if you look at the broad picture, including those led by the left parties, certainly CSP, including communists, for most of the time, if you leave aside the Telangana armed struggle, even Tibhaga, most of the time was a peaceful movement. Only at the end, the clashes occurred. And violence usually is indulged in by the oppressors, not by the peasants. And when you get some instances, it is resisting that violence. You rarely find the peasants on their own organizing violence against the oppressors. So these are all features which we have to keep into mind, and maybe another occasion when we can talk about so many other issues. I am looking at the time, and I think I've already taken an hour, and we should stop here and take the questions.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful, very insightful lecture. And as you said, the consciousness was present in the peasantry from the very beginning. And to understand today's situations, we have to look into the history of pre-independence struggles that India had and witnessed, and it involved peasant in a very large number. So calling themselves uh, unpolitical or less political is not fair with the consciousness of
Yes.
peasants. So we have some questions from the audience, and the first question is from Tapti Sen Gupta. The question is, now that we are taking a new look at the pandemic 100 years ago, do you think the peasants and their output was in any way affected by loss of population in Western India at the time of Bardoli?
Bardoli. Bardoli is 1928, and the flu epidemic is 1918 and 19. So I'm not sure what the connection would be between the and the Bardoli movement. If you're talking about what impact it might have had on the non-cooperation movement, you know, in terms of reduction of the population and all that. I'm not aware. I mean, in the studies which have been done, I'm not familiar with any research which has made that connection between the pandemic, and the flu epidemic and the movement.
Yeah. The next question is rather interesting. It is from Harsha Vardhan Elluri, and his question is: the early Kisan mobilization into Kisan Sabhas was influenced by Congress-led nationalist movement, but by late 20s and 30s, Kisan Sabha increasingly influenced by the left ideology, and it moved away from Congress quote unquote hold. Is it due to the disappointment or disagreement with Gandhian struggle, or is it due to haunting spectra of Marxism across colonies and countries? So, can you throw some light on it?
Firstly, I think I'd like to say that my understanding is not in terms of it moving away, because in fact what I have shown is that when it is more, the active role is played by the left groups within the freedom struggle. I do not see them as outside the Congress. I do not see Congress as equal to non-left. Right through the course of the freedom struggle, the left worked inside the freedom struggle, inside the Congress organizationally also, except for short period from 1929, once the Sixth Congress line came. And unfortunately, that coincided with the civil disobedience movement. So, but 1934, once the situation changed in Europe and all that, United Front line came again. So they were back working inside the Congress Socialist Party, right? So I don't see them as outside. Harkishan Singh Surjit, who was a major Kisan leader, later General Secretary of the Congress of the CPM, and a major leader in Punjab, whom I had interviewed at great length on his role and his understanding of the whole situation at that time. A very very long interview. I'm quoting from him. He said, when he said that Congress and you, he said, what do you keep saying this? We were the Congress in the villages. We meaning left. So he didn't see himself as outside the Congress. They were part of the Congress. Within Congress, there are people of different ideological persuasions. So in fact, he says we were the Congress in rural Punjab. So I think we have to understand it also slightly differently. So I don't see it as a disillusionment with Congress at all. In the first phase of the mass movement, which is non-cooperation period, left ideology had not yet come to India at all, right? Russian Revolution had just happened. It is from 1923-24 that we get the first inklings. In fact, Dange does write in 22 Gandhi versus Lenin. He's among the first. But 23, 24, very small groups of people who understand left ideology, then they start forming little groups in different parts of India. It's only by 26, 27 that a significant enough number of people become familiar, and these worker peasant parties which they are formed, or in Punjab the Kirti Kisan party, they begin to play a role. Naujawan Bharat Sabha of Bhagat Singh, for example. So, and during the period of civil disobedience movement, as I said, the CPI is not there. CSP has not yet been formed. So left is not there in the movement, in the civil disobedience movement, which is, but that doesn't mean that there are not people who are committed to the peasant over there. I see Vallabhbhai Patel. How can we say that? Bardoli movement was led by Vallabhbhai Patel, not a leftist by any means. You don't have to be a leftist to be committed to the peasant. Vallabhbhai Patel was as committed to zamindari abolition. He was from peasant stock himself. See, we often mix up these things. No doubt, by the mid 30s, it is the left elements who are now within the Congress who play the active role. But N.G. Ranga, for example, N.G. Ranga was never in the Communist Party of India. Yes, he was influenced by Russian Revolution, but he was a very different kind of character. Even Swami Sahajanand was not a typical leftist. He's a Swami after all. He comes from a different persuasion. So it's a very mixed situation. So it's not just it, and it's not left versus right. But no doubt left elements are more active in this period, 35, 36, 37, 38. And in this All India Kisan Sabha organization, left dominates. And when I say left, CSP must be included, because most communists are working within the CSP. And only in 1939, they begin to separate from CSP. When again, it becomes a question of when the World War starts, and then this whole People's War versus, imperialist war, People's War, all these issues begin to come to the front.
We'll take one last question, and this is from Sukhdev Sohal from Amritsar, and his question is
hello Sukhdev.
His question is, can you please comment on agricultural stagnation in the 30s as studied by George Blind? This situation necessitated peasants' agitation. So similar situation we are seeing in India today. Can you talk about
Yes,
that?
I think what my very dear friend and colleague, we have been fellow researchers on Punjab for last 40 years or more, and he knows much more about Punjab than I do. And I really respect his scholarship. Uh, I think the question he's raising is very pertinent. George Blind's work on agricultural history, on statistics of British India, brings out the fact that in the whole of India, but about Punjab, on which I have also written, that this is a period of where there is no agricultural growth taking place. And of course, with the economic depression which sets in 1929-30, and the collapse of the prices of produce, where sometimes it is more than 50% decline in the prices. Question of growth doesn't arise. It's a question of survival is becoming difficult for the peasant. In fact, the data shows that in order to pay the land revenue, the peasants are having to take out their meager resources of gold savings. Peasant sells gold only as a last resort, because they look upon what little gold they may have collected as something which they will, take out only when everything else has failed. The huge amounts of exports take place of gold from the Punjab. This is remarked upon by the British officials, including Malcolm Darling, who knew Punjab very well. So this is a period of desperation for the Punjab peasant, for the Punjab agricultural worker, because if peasant doesn't have any any money, where is he going to hire agriculture labor from? So there is a complete, yes, he's very right. These conditions were prevailing, and of course it led to militancy among the peasants, because the role of economic discontent is subtle. It's not that you become economically discontented and you go out and pick up a stone and start throwing it. Economic discontent creates in the mind of the sufferer a climate of questioning, of discomfort, of looking for alternatives. And then when an opportunity arises to express that, you take to that. So the opportunity has to also arise. Sometimes you can be very discontented but find no way of expression. And my theory is that is when peasant suicides take place. If there is a movement or protest going on, there will be no suicides. Because the peasant is able to express his anger, his anguish, through struggle. There is hope. A struggle gives hope. Suicide is an act of hopelessness. One reason we've had these suicides in India is because it was a phase where there was very little peasant protest. In post-independence India, peasant protest has not been there after the 1980s. So low periods of peasant protest have coincided with the inward anguish, of the peasant. So I agree with him. And that also is the situation, what he's talking about now. And it's leading it led to the suicide also, and it's leading to the protests also.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukherjee, for taking out time this morning to deliver today's Karwan lecture series. And it is totally our honor and privilege to host you. And we were wanting to host you for a very long time. Finally, this was the opportunity. And I think many people are commenting that this is going to be very helpful. They loved the session. Thank you so much. And it was truly an honor.
Thank you so much, Ishan. And thank you to the audience for their patience. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, ma'am. And those who are watching us, there is a request. Please do subscribe to Karwan. Please do share the videos and please like the video. Drop your comments. And if you want to ask any question to Professor Mukherjee, send us at karwanheritage@gmail.com. We'll forward that to Professor Mukherjee and she'll get back to you via email. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.